The third round clash between Magnus Carlsen and Sergey Karjakin in the Bilbao Masters was of course eagerly anticipated. They'll be facing each other in November for the title of world champion. So what could we expect from this game? Well, frankly, I thought both players might play rather safety first, but how wrong I was to be. Carlson with the white pieces opened with 1e4. Well, it's funny, I was doing live commentary on this game and someone commented, well, is this a bit of bluff by Carlson? Does this mean that he won't be playing e4 in the World Championship match in November? Well, I don't think Carlson even knows which first move he's going to be using in November. So, no, I think the players are just playing pretty normal openings. Karjakin looks like he's ready to play the Najdorf. Well, no big surprise there, he's played that before. But very sensibly, as is so often the case, Carlson sidesteps any potential opening preparation and plays something a bit left field, c3. Not a very common move at the elite level. White wants to play d4, of course. But the problem is after knight f6, d4 is impossible because the pawn is on prise. So this is a version of the c3 Sicilian which isn't really very good, but it is seen sometimes. Bishop e2. Here's the point that, of course, that pawn can't be taken because of queen a4 check, and then you win the knight. I mean, there are loads of ways to meet this. My favourite way of tackling this is to play bishop d7. And that means that knight takes e4 is a threat, so white has to deal with this straight away. And for example, if you play d3, then somehow white's setup looks too modest. And well, here's an example. Vasily Grave played this with black. And this is a very sensible setup. Black gets a kind of Spanish pawn structure, but with very well placed pieces. The bishop already on g7. That's a reasonable way to play. Karjakin, as is so often the case, played a kind of main line, you could say, against this. g6. And now white still can't play d4 because then you could take the e pawn. But Carlson played bishop b5 check, which is a move that's been very popular over the past 15 years or so, and has kind of rehabilitated this whole variation. This gives white something to play for. It's still fine for black. This is a reasonable move. Carlson has actually faced this before and played this move himself. For example, like this, knight fd7. Now you allow white to play d4, but after the exchange of bishops, I mean, not too much can happen to black here. You normally play knight c6 and provoke this pawn into advancing, and you know, this is a very nice bishop on this diagonal. But Karjakin played something that's a little bit unusual, knight c6, which allows white to play d4. Obviously that can't be taken because of d5. And then he played queen b6. Well, this is quite ambitious. So black would very much like white to give up the two bishops. And here, yeah, I mean, black can look to the future with confidence. It's double-edged, of course, once white gives up the bishop pair. But Carlson played very steadily. He just withdrew the bishop. Still can't take here because of d5. But Karjakin exchanged and castles. Now here, if white just develops peace, knight c3, then bishop g4 is a bit annoying. You know, there's a lot of pressure on this pawn. This is the whole point of playing this move, queen b6, that there's lots of pressure on white's centre. So Carlson didn't even play that. He just pushed the pawn straight away. And now Karjakin quite quickly just put the knight back to b8 and recycled the knight. But actually, I don't see anything wrong with playing knight a5. This has actually been played in a previous game. And then bishop g4, this is a good move. And this is rather similar to the Carlson-Karjakin game, except black just gets the knight to c4 a lot quicker. Let's compare and contrast with the game. So knight b8 played, not a bad move, and again this idea, bishop g4. Exchanging, this means that black is able to control lots of squares along this long diagonal. And the bishop on c8 wasn't doing too much anyway, so not a bad idea to exchange it off. And now at knight d7. So the knight returns into play, and indeed can end up on c4, but you see it would have been much quicker just to play it in 2 moves. But black still has a reasonable position here. I think chances are about equal, but the difference between this position and the other variation with knight a5 is that Carlsen has time to regroup his pieces and kind of strengthen his queenside before this knight comes into c4. But black's position is still quite reasonable. So black, looking to get play, perhaps knight c5, perhaps knight c4. I was anticipating king h1 here, with perhaps the brutal idea of advancing the f-pawn, well, certainly to f4 anyway. But Carlsen played a nice move, bishop g5. I think it's one of those very irritating moves, attacking the e-pawn. And black has a tricky decision. Well, obviously you don't want to play f6, that blocks out the bishop. You don't really want to play king f8, because, well, then I will play king h1, and somehow there is more potential for attack with the king on the f-file. I guess black could play bishop f6, but, well, there are a couple of things. You might just move the bishop to h6, but you could trade, and I'm sure Karjakin was reluctant to exchange off this wonderful bishop. And now, really, this helps to strengthen white's queenside. And then maybe king h2 and perhaps f4. But in the end, Karjakin decided on h6, so it's quite a committal move. First of all, it's probably not very good to take on e7. But g5 locks in the bishop. I mean, white can complicate it after this, but black is getting 2 pieces for the rook, and, well, these dart squares look fantastic for black once that knight comes into d6. So Carlsen rejected bishop takes e7 and instead just dropped the bishop back to h4. Well, why do I say h6 is slightly risky? Because it weakens black's kingside a bit, so that now moving the king to the side and advancing the f-pawn really is a much more dangerous proposition. But in playing h6, Karjakin actually intended this very brave move, g5. It's interesting, this reminds me of Karjakin's game yesterday against Geary, where he did something similar. Karjakin did something similar, playing h3 and g4 to basically solidify the position of the knight on e4, because it covered f5. And this time Karjakin's doing it with colours reversed. The point of playing g5, of course, is to make sure that f4 can be met by an exchange, and that means that the position of the knight on e5 is safe. But it's very, very risky playing like this, because when f4 comes, the king is much weaker. Let's see what happened. Queen a6 from Karjakin. Of course, he would very much like an exchange of queens. then he could attack on B and C files. So Carlson's not having any of that. Queen D1, that makes sure that D3 is still covered. And now, a tricky moment. Black would like to play knight C4, but I think Karjakin was probably a bit phased by bishop D3. Slightly unpleasant pin, and after knight C5, well, could just drop back to E2. And black can take a pawn, but suddenly this is getting a little bit tricky. The B file opens, this pin is still annoying. Do you really want to take here and open up the F file? Not sure. So Karjakin went for rook C4. But that rook can be a bit vulnerable. King H1, and now Carlson's getting ready to launch the F pawn. There it goes. And after this exchange, you can see that pawn on H6 is a little bit vulnerable. It'd be much better if the pawn were on H7, but okay, that's purely hypothetical. Queen B6. Perhaps, well, it's a best square on these dart squares. Performs more on these squares. But Queen H5. Now Carlson is turning his attention to the king side. And you can see he's still solid enough on the queen side. This rook holding everything together. And Queen F5. And that's a little bit annoying because the queen keeps tabs on this rook. And that restricts the movement of the rook on C4. Queen came back to D8. And now the rook getting pushed a little bit. And bishop takes knight on E5. After this trade, you can see that bishop is locked in. And black has very little counterplay at this point. Queen D7. That knocks the queen back just for a moment. Of course, Carlson not interested in the queen exchange. Now, a tricky moment. I was sure that Karjakin would trade rooks here just to, well, exchange off one of white's attacking pieces. Carlson still has potential here. If that knight swings over to the king side, maybe landing on F5, that could be good. Karjakin played a very brave move. Instead of exchanging, he kept this rook active. It keeps an eye on E4, but is very risky. And now I was thinking during the game that perhaps D6 would be a good move. This is a classic Carlson pawn sacrifice. If takes, then knight D5, and suddenly, you know, look at this fantastic bishop. But of course, black would play E6, blunting that bishop on B3. Of course, still dangerous, you know, with a nice passed pawn, but a little bit double-edged because this bishop looks like it's cut out of the game. Instead, Carlson played rook D2, slightly mysterious move, but watch what happens. G4, he's preparing to swing the rook across the second rank, and just with a very direct attack on black's king. Now, in round one, Carlson played a very aggressive G-pawn thrust against Nakamura, and it blew up in his face. So this is a brave move from Carlson. You know, he might be thinking, you know, do I really want to play in such a risky way? Because if it rebounds, then his king could be exposed. So it's a brave move, but looks very strong. The rook swinging across. And yeah, G5 coming very quickly. So Karjakin just prevented that one with knight H7, but a very passive move. And H4, this pawn thrust still coming. Rook B6. So Karjakin showing that he's not cracking yet. The rook defending along the 6th rank. And here I thought that he was going to play rook G6, threatening this pawn. and then probably rook g1. And, well, I mean, Carlson has various ways to try and make progress. It could be a direct attack here. If this is exchanged, then white can switch to the h-file, that's one thing. But sometimes you might be able to bring this bishop into play as well, after the queen moves here or h5. But Karjakin played king h8. Now this really means that he can't ever exchange on g5 because the attack on the h-file will be just too strong. Rook g1. So preparing to open up the g-file, and now f5. I mean, rook g6 was maybe the last chance, but it's not good for black. But f5 is not a good move. Queen h3 very quickly played by Carlson. Players are a little bit short of time here, particularly Karjakin. This is horrible now. Black's position is going to get ripped apart. There's going to be no defense on the g-file now. Obviously that pawn is pinned. Rook b4. This is desperate stuff, hoping for some kind of defense along here, but watch what happens. The g-file just got ripped open, and now queen g3, threatening a checkmate with queen g8 as well as queen takes pawn, and now queen g6, and black's position collapses completely. If knight g8 back again, then queen h5 threatening rook g8 and queen h6. Karjakin played knight g4, but rook takes, followed by queen takes bishop, and that's the end of that. Well, what a tremendous attacking performance from Carlson, and that's really sending a message to Karjakin, who somehow, I think he got caught in two minds in the early middle game and plumped for g5, but really underestimated Carlson's attacking chances. After the game, Carlson said, "I think my play could be better, but at least it's going in the right direction, and my loss in the first round forced me to play more sharply." Great game. Round 4 tomorrow. Look out for my reports on PowerPlayChess. Thanks very much.